Welcome to the Big 12 Insiders, your Big 12 sports show. Here's your host, Brien Hanley.
Hey, everybody, what's going on? This is your man, Big B, Brien Hanley, along with my man, Tim Fitzgerald, and welcome to the Big 12 Insiders. You know, Fitz, the college football playoff, the first weekend is over. We saw some stuff, basically some blowouts, some games that just weren't competitive. I guess the Texas-Clemson game was somewhat competitive, but the rest were not. They were absolute blowouts. And there's a lot of people out there talking about, well, you know, there's always been blowouts. And you're right. But maybe there could have been more competitive games. You put some other teams in. You do some seeding right. I don't want to make too big a deal about it because it's the first year of it. You can always make tweaks to make things better. But I think it's something that needs to be done. But what I want to talk about today, though, Fitz, is, you know, this narrative of ESPN and SEC. I guess it's not really a narrative. I mean, they're married at the hip at this point. Kind of blowing up in their face. This just isn't going the way that I think they thought it was going to go. Number one, not having as many teams in this thing. One of the teams that they pump their chest about is not very good, or let me not say not very good. They got the doors blown off of them.
Right.
Let's say that. And if we were really paying attention, they weren't that good all year anyway. But it is what it is. First off, what are your thoughts about all of that?
Well, should I be surprised that a team that is seated, let's say 11th, might be the 12th best team? They might not be seated that way, but in reality, they might be the 12th best team in this playoff, playing a team that could possibly have a bye if we went with the top four seeds on their home field, that they got blown out. No, I'm not surprised at all. I think among all the lessons we've learned from this is, first, what we're going to talk about is ESPN's ongoing tiresome narrative isn't accurate to the extent they think it is. Look, I don't think anyone's arguing that the SEC isn't the best overall conference from terms of top teams and all that. But even that might be subject to debate now. But also, I think the biggest lesson that nobody's talking about is it's really cool. We just played 4 playoff games on home fields that were earned to a degree. And it was a huge advantage.
Yes.
Playing at home is the real story here, not the quality of some of the teams in it. Although, look, Indiana was a creation of just a schedule that was bastardized. I don't think it was intentional by the Big Ten, but boy, I got to tell you something, Big B. If you start looking through the Big Ten, you realize that they bent their schedule in favor of having more, quote, good games.
Mm-hmm.
And leaving a team like Indiana and Rutgers and others with really light schedules. And this was the effect.
Yeah.
So I don't know how to stop that, but it's going to be ongoing because we saw it in the Big 12 too. Some schools just had easier schedules.
Mm-hmm.
And there was no way to predict in the Big 12 that those were going to be the easy schedules. It just happens that way. But one, ESPN, just stop with this because you're going to lose this battle, and I'll get into why I think so. But also, let's not discredit the entire playoff because the big change here was home games. That's what we changed. We didn't just invite more teams. We had home games, and the home field advantage was enormous in a way that we don't see in the NFL.
Well, and that's what the difference is, or I shouldn't say the different, one of the differences, but look, ESPN, SEC, you're exactly right. They're trying to discredit the entire playoff now because they didn't get the teams that they thought should have gotten in. So now, well, it's not really that big of a deal. You see Lane Kiffin out there just barking, screaming up a storm. I'm like, hey, Lane Kiffin, don't lose to Florida and don't lose to Kentucky.
Right.
You don't lose those 2 games. You're not having this discussion. You're not having to tweet during the first weekend of the college football playoff. Guess what? You're in. But since every year you seem to choke when the bright lights are the brightest, you have no argument. So it's same thing with Alabama. Don't lose to Vanderbilt. And I don't want to hear, well, Vanderbilt's not the same Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt was so good, they couldn't give a loss to Georgia State. That's how good this Vandy team is. They lost to Georgia State. I don't want to hear it. Don't want to hear it. Oh, by the way, Alabama, if you don't get pasted by Oklahoma, you're not having this conversation. You're right there where you need to be. But instead, this is where you are. So enough already. You didn't qualify. I just don't understand why you can't just accept that you didn't qualify. You didn't. You had needed to win more games. There are other teams that have more gripes or more beefs to be in this than you. Can't lose 3 games. And just to me, it's the gall or the arrogance to just say that the playoff is null and void because, oh, well, 3 SEC teams got in. One of them just got the doors blown off of them. Again, like you mentioned, home field advantage. I think that's a big thing. First of all, I love it that they're playing these first-round games on college campuses. I think that's great. It's good for college football. It's good for these individual campuses. It's good for everything. I think it is outstanding that you have a playoff at home. I think that is great.
Really cool.
But to try to go to the links that they are going now to say, well, somebody else does. Look, I admit, I don't think Indiana deserved to be in. I don't even really think that SMU should have been in. But that doesn't mean that I think somebody from the SEC should have been in. That's not my point. That's not my argument. So I think next year they're going to go into it with a little more, okay, who did you play? Who did you beat? Let's put that out there so everybody knows. Kind of like the NCAA tournament. People bash on that every year, Fitz, but more times than not, they get it right.
Yeah.
Who did you play and who did you beat? That matters. Now you can get into all to the nerd analytics and all that kind of stuff, which to me, that's exactly what it is. It's nerd analytics. Just who did you play and who did you beat? Okay. And it's just that simple. In football, though, it's different because it has to be because there's not so many games. You play so many less. Who did you lose to? And that matters. And how did you lose? All of that stuff matters. It's not that complicated to me, Fitz. It really isn't.
I agree. Totally agree. The problem with this argument is they're going to continue to bend the argument. Who did we play? We played Vanderbilt. They're really good. They're in the SEC.
Correct.
It's an unbeatable argument, but it's also a recipe for disaster right now in the current environment. And I shared this thought with you before we started, and I don't mean this in a political sense, but ESPN needs to be careful here. We've seen now the rise of independent media impact a presidential election in a way we never expected, and showed it's more powerful than the narrative being promoted by any one established network. Now, we're not that far along with independent media in the sports world. Let's be honest. The biggest podcasts continue to be the biggest people on TV.
Right.
We don't have a Joe Rogan or Tim Pool or a guy named Theo or any of those. We don't have any of that yet. Maybe I'm missing someone, and if so, please drop it in the comments because I want to listen to someone that's truly independent. And this narrative is going to blow up on ESPN. They're going to start experiencing an incredible pushback. And this has been my point with the SEC trying to form their own super league with the Big Ten. Oh, you might have the most households, but wait until you find out the other households ain't playing your game, homie. I mean, we're not going to do it. We're not going to watch it. We don't accept this narrative, and we're going to watch our teams. I ended up watching North Dakota State on Saturday because it was a better game. And that's what will happen if they try to form a super league that isn't as super as they think it is. Let's wait to this next round because I'm curious. I'm really curious what playing a game before your opponent gets to, what impact that has. Does it make Texas even better, or does it wear Texas out as they go into the Arizona State game? I don't know. Let's find out.
Well, and also another thing with it is I'm interested to see this next round because what are they going to do? Are they going to say, you know what, last year we didn't put in enough SEC teams. We're going to rank them so that when that happens, is the Big Ten going to play ball with that?
No.
Because I got a feeling that the Big Ten is just about fed up with what the SEC is trying to pull. Now, don't get me wrong. I've said it a million times. Heck, I said it 5 minutes ago. I don't think Indiana should have been in because they didn't play anybody. And the times that they did, they got whipped. Okay. But even having said all of that, I think the Big Ten is just kind of fed up with this narrative of, well, the SEC is just so superior to everybody else. No matter what, they have to have 5 teams in or this thing isn't legitimate. And I think the Big Ten's fed up with that. Now, again, I think they want to play in that field a little bit, Fitz, because I think they like having a little bit of the superiority complex to everybody else. But again, you mentioned it before. Of the Big Ten teams, we're not talking about a conference full of juggernauts. That is not what we're dealing with the Big Ten. But I also think the Big Ten knows that, Fitz.
Mm-hmm.
I think the Big Ten understands, okay, we are extremely top heavy right now. Let's play to that. Goes back to your point of talking about scheduling. They wanted to make the best games in the conference with the teams that they knew, or at least they thought, were going to be the best teams in the conference. And then these other teams, we're not going to have them play such a big schedule because why? Nobody's going to watch. We don't want the TV. We're not going to mangle up any TV or anything like that with these football games. Well, okay, that's fine. But I think the Big Ten is kind of smart here, Fitz. They understand we're top heavy. We know it, and we're going to play by those rules. But we're not also going to get pushed around by the SEC with them thinking they're superior. Stop losing games. That's all. I think that's all the Big Ten people are just going to say. Stop losing games. Your teams are so good at the top. Stop losing.
Yep.
I don't want to hear that there's all these football teams that are all good. Hey, that's fine. Who's the great one? Oh, you don't have one. Okay, well, since you don't have a great team, I don't want to hear about how everybody's just great. No, you're not. You stop losing 3 games a year. You can't get in losing 3 games a year, period, end of story. And I like what the Big Ten, because I've heard from some Big Ten people, they're starting to push back on that they're getting real tired of it, Fitz.
Oh, they should. They absolutely should. And let's just go ahead and point out that this narrative was the same last year. Right? The narrative hasn't changed one bit. They still think they're better than everyone else, and to a degree, the Big Ten does. Then how come Oregon and Texas walked into your conference and played straight up with you?
Exactly.
In fact, Oregon was the best team in the Big Ten. How does that make sense? How can someone from a lesser conference move into your conference and immediately dominate? And take Texas as an example. Yeah, they won the last season, but they haven't been dominant of the Big 12 for the last 10 years or whatever. It's a false narrative. Granted, I think Sark has them going in the right direction, but if you were so good, nobody's walking in and kicking your butts, and that happened. But I think a lot of people might be missing a greater lesson that certainly ESPN and the SEC doesn't want to talk about, and I'm not sure Fox with the Big Ten wants to talk about it. The 4th place teams got smoked.
Yeah.
Maybe we shouldn't allow 4 teams in from a conference. Let's talk about that. If we're going to have 12 schools in this playoff, and one of them is going to be Notre Dame, typically, they'll always get in as long as they're not horrible. That's my belief. And one is going to be a non-power conference team. You're talking about 4 out of the 10, 40% of the rest belong to one conference. I don't buy it. I don't think that's the way it should be. And I think the reason why the SEC is so determined to keep it that way is they know damn well if they start letting in more, like Miami was in instead of Indiana, or BYU was in instead of Indiana, then we start losing the narrative that all of our teams are better than all of your teams.
Correct.
Which is just absurd. And no one is accepting it anymore outside of the cults of the ESPN SEC. It's turned into a cult where they believe things that just aren't true and are so convinced of it. It's fascinating to watch.
Yeah.
You're not that. You're better. I'm going to admit that the top teams, the Big Ten and SEC right now, because of money, which is a topic you're probably going to get into later this week, particularly in the portal, you've got a huge advantage because you're just buying players left and right. But it doesn't mean your entire conference is better. It doesn't. Stop with this crap. Stop. What do you think, Big B? I'm gonna kick it back to you with this.
Mm-hmm.
How would have Ole Miss fared in the Big 12 in this hyper competitive from top to bottom conference?
I mean, Ole Miss was a good football team,
Yep.
but they would have been Arizona State, BYU,
Right.
Colorado. That's what they would have been. Because, again, Ole Miss is losing to teams that would have done the exact, like, for instance, Kentucky's in the Big 12. They have the same record. Ole Miss lost to them. Ole Miss is going to come to the Big 12 and do the exact same thing, lose to those teams. Now, you're going to get people, Ole Miss would have just run the conference. Where's your proof to that? How they lost to Kentucky? How they lost to Florida? That's your proof? Oh, no, they beat Georgia. Well, okay, great. They beat Georgia, which means they can beat the top teams in any conference. I'll grant you that. But they can also lose to bottom feeders, which they did. And while Florida's not a bottom feeder, Florida's average, and everybody knows it. Miami went to Florida at the beginning of the year and destroyed them in Florida. And don't tell me, well, it was at the beginning of the year. So Florida wasn't prepared for the game and Miami was? Is that what you're saying? Okay, gotcha. Nothing matters at the beginning of the year. I don't want to hear it.
Yep.
Bottom line is that some of these teams, the superiority complex is not what it used to be. Just face this fact. The transfer portal, whether you like it or not, has made things more level. How do you think Indiana went 11-1? I don't care that they didn't play anybody. Indiana's team last year isn't going – that football team that they had last year with this schedule isn't going 11-1. That's not happening. What they did was they hired a new coach. He brought in some other players. They brought in better players, and boom, you get 11-1. That's what all of this has come down to. It's not 10 years ago where Alabama and Clemson and Georgia, and you could even throw LSU in there, were just running things. It's not that way anymore. Throw Ohio State into all of that. It's just not that way anymore, man. The transfer portal has equaled things out, and SEC, ESPN, and the Big Ten to an extent can't handle it.
Right.
They just can't deal with it. And you know what? I'll push back. I'm not even going to throw the Big Ten into that because, like I mentioned, Fitz, the Big Ten realizes the things that are going on. They understand who they are, I guess is a better question. Very self-aware. They get it. We're top heavy. We're going to play to that. And that's all we're going to play to. We're not trying to convince you, that Northwestern is any good because maybe they upset somebody. They're not trying to convince you that Rutgers is some juggernaut because maybe they beat somebody. That's not what the Big Ten is trying to do. The SEC is trying to convince you that every single team in their conference can go to any other conference and just dominate it. When we saw Arkansas play an Oklahoma State team, that Oklahoma State was so good that they couldn't win a Big 12 game, but yet they beat Arkansas. So, and that same Arkansas beat Tennessee. So I don't want to hear about how you're so superior. It drives me insane. It's going to take a while, though, for that narrative to kick in, Fitz, that they're not the superiority. But also, like you mentioned, as far as mainstream media and podcast, that narrative is going to get overtaken because people like the non-main or the non-traditional media. People like that space. They not only do they like to get in it, like myself, yourself, they like to listen to it because you tend to get things that are more real. You don't get the fake, and people get tired of fake. Whether you agree with what they say or not, at least you know it's the truth. Right. And I think that Fitz is what people like. They like the truth. They get tired of it. And I'll push this back to you. The one thing that I loved, Joel Klatt, I don't know if you saw his tweet. He basically tweeted at Lane Kiffin when Lane Kiffin was talking about the committee and saying, oh, great job. These are competitive games. And Joel Klatt just came right back at him and tweeted at him, hey, Lane, if your team played as good as you tweeted, you'd be playing right now. I loved it. I'm like, daggone right. Somebody fire back at these buffoons for all this nonsense. I thought it was a class act. And then Joel Klatt came on and said, yeah, I'm not apologizing. I said it. I meant it. I'm not taking it back because it's the truth.
The SEC's not used to that.
No.
They've controlled the narrative for so long, and all that is slipping away. It really is, and they don't see it. Okay, let's take this angle. I don't think Indiana was very good. I've said that all year long. Their schedule, you almost could not have made a lighter schedule for them. They played the entire bottom half of the Big Ten, basically. So I recognize that. But you know what they didn't do? They didn't lose to the Big Ten equivalent of Kentucky.
Nope.
Or the Big Ten equivalent of Vanderbilt.
Nope.
They won.
Mm-hmm.
And this narrative that we have to talk about who you played as much as who you beat. No, I'm sorry. I still believe in most cases a loss is not as good as a win. And
you would think.
you look at Indiana, and I see a team that maybe isn't at the highest level, maybe isn't among the top 12, but they won all the games they should have won. And any coach will tell you that is not easy.
No.
That's not easy, even if you are an elite team. But here's another point, SEC. Quit talking about how tough your schedule is when you only play 8 conference games. Correct. We know what you're doing. The world is catching on. You park a win in November to make you look good and puff out your chest. And you've gotten away with it for one reason. ESPN. They have supported you in this addiction to beating bad teams.
Right.
They're an enabler of your crappy scheduling, your cowardly scheduling. If we want to stop this narrative, let's go and have a serious discussion about the parameters for picking teams. Let's do it. And let's start with 9 conference games. If you play 8, you got a strike against you. It's a loss.
Right.
It's a loss. That to me, that makes sense. Let's all be on a level playing field. You talk about your playing field so tough, we don't accept it, in part because you're playing one less conference game. You're basically scheduling a victory for your entire conference. You're adding 8 wins possibly to your schedule. We see it. The world is seeing it. We're all talking about it because ESPN doesn't have a chokehold on the narrative.
Yeah, that's the thing. And I know some people are going to push back. Well, the ACC only plays 8 conference games, and you're right.
They should.
But you don't see the ACC out there puffing their chest about how difficult their conference schedule is and all of this stuff. You don't see them out there pumping their chest about we only need to play 8 because of how tough our conference is. They don't do it. Now, also, if you notice some of the ACC teams, they tend to play 2 or 3 Power 4 schools in their non-conference schedule. So they're not playing, Mercer in the middle of November. That's not usually typically what's happened. They play 2 or 3 Power 4 schools in their non-conference schedule. Now, do I think they need to go up to 9? Yes, I do. Absolutely. But again, you don't hold the ACC to that same SEC criticism because the ACC isn't out there puffing their chest about how their schedule is, and that's all they need is our conference schedule is tough enough. That's all we need to do. And my whole thinking behind that is, look, we see what happens with this. They rank all these SEC teams every year. They put them in there. So when somebody beats them, they beat a ranked team. They beat a ranked team. Like Missouri. Why is Missouri ranked? A&M. Those teams aren't ranked. They're not the 21st or 23rd best teams in the country, and everybody knows that. But yet somehow they slip into the rankings, and here they are. And I'm just like, what? Huh? Why? How? And that's what they do. They do it every year. And more people are starting to see through it, Fitz, just like you said. Every year, more people are like, well, wait a minute. And that's the conversation. That's the kind of the wheels turning, the gears grinding in their head. Like, well, wait a second. Well, hold on a minute. Really, that's what's being done. And people are starting to see right through it. And eventually they're going to have to change because You're just not going to have the chokehold that you believe that you have. Nobody, again, that's why I separate the Big Ten. I recognize the Big Ten's arrogance. I do. I recognize it. But I also recognize that the Big Ten just knows who they are. They understand that, like I mentioned, and I'll say it till the cows come home. They're not trying to convince you that the bottom of their league is the best that there ever was. They're just not trying to convince you that a Northwestern is going to the ACC and winning the conference. They're not trying to tell you that. But the SEC will. They'll try to tell you that Mississippi State, who was god-awful, could go any other conference, Power 4 conference, and win it. That's what they're trying to tell you, and it's just not true. And the narrative, Fitz, is old and tired. And I like how this is playing out in the college football playoff. Now, look, that doesn't mean that Georgia isn't going to win this thing. That doesn't mean that Texas isn't going to win this thing, because those are extremely talented football teams. But it's just two. And we've already established that those teams are really, really good. But they're going to be good no matter what. But that doesn't mean that there's not a huge drop-off behind them and other deserving teams, other deserving conferences. But I thought that's what everybody wanted, is they wanted other teams to be a part of this. Now that they're getting it, it is just sour grapes. They can't handle it. And I love it, Fitz. I love every bit of it.
Okay, here's a compromise. If you don't want to play a ninth game, whether the SEC or ACC, let's put a baseline of playing 10 power level games.
Yeah.
In your schedule, and anything below that is dinged. You got, you go down a little bit in your value. And if you decide to play 11 or God forbid 12 games against power level teams, you get rewarded for it because you are truly playing a tougher schedule. Don't tell me how good the SEC is when you have to schedule these games in November that anyone could win. Now, I'm going to give an exception here. Some schools like South Carolina and Georgia use that game for a rivalry. Correct. And I appreciate that. But how do you with a straight face continue to argue that Georgia is so much better than everyone else when Georgia Tech almost won on Georgia's home field? It took 8 overtimes to pull out the miracle. It felt like the ending of that long ago Soviet U.S. gold medal game where they kept giving them a redo until the Soviets won. I mean, it's incredible to me that not only is this narrative that strong, but let me remind everyone, Georgia went up in the standings following that game. They rose. No other conference would get that treatment. Zero. No other program would get that treatment. And that argument, that game alone goes against the argument that I'm posing that, okay, Georgia and Texas are better than the rest. Maybe they are. But I don't think it's as big as gap as you think.
No. Nope.
Because Big B, I watched Texas. I watched them play Clemson. Dude, that's the same Texas program that was in the Big 12 last year. Yes, they won the Big 12. But, I mean, they had troubles with some teams. And the year before that, they didn't make it to the championship. This is basically the same Texas team that was last year. A very good team. But better, clearly better than everyone else in the world? No.
Correct.
Everything's so fluid right now in college football. And this is what the SEC is trying to fight against. We have to stop the count. We have to freeze this narrative right here because we're ahead. Greg Sankey, don't play the Big 12 and ACC in the non-con. Well, why? Oh, because your argument's defeated if you lose. Only play the Big 10 in the non-con. Oh, I see. So you never play a bad team. That, in your perception, you never play a bad team. This has gone insane, and I'm glad to see that a lot of people, including some ESPN people, are beginning to push back. Shout out to Sean McDonough for what he did on TNT. Now, let's point that out. He was on TNT and said things that blew my mind. It was literally one of those few moments in watching sports when I'm kind of listening to the game because it's a blowout, and but I'm watching, I'm listening, and I start hearing, I'm like, is he saying what I think he's saying? That, yeah, Indiana didn't belong, but maybe we overvalued the Big Ten, and maybe we're doing it with the SEC too. What? Keep an eye on his contract. I'm dead serious.
Yeah.
Keep an eye on his contract. Anyone who's pushed against the ESPN narrative, whatever that is, whatever corporate wants you to say, anyone who pushes back, they're gone.
Yep.
I'm going to keep an eye on that one. That's a tough one to fire. But if he keeps it up, and I'm sure it's being made clear to him, you do this again, you're gone. We see what's going on. This isn't about truth. It's about money. It's about business. You don't really need to believe the SEC is better. You need to sell that because your entire corporation now is wrapped into SEC being better. And if that narrative fails, well, it's not good news for ESPN.
No. Sean McDonough hit it right on the head. Maybe it's time for us to stop overvaluing the SEC and the Big Ten like they're just so superior to everybody. If you haven't seen that tweet, you need to go find it. It's outstanding. There's
From
a clip
awful
of
announcing.
literally saying it in the football game of Notre Dame against Indiana. It's incredible, and he's exactly right. Maybe it's that time. Maybe we've hit that. We've people that don't follow the SEC and Big Ten have thought that for a long time. I call the SEC super top heavy. I've said it for years because they are. The Big Ten, I don't say that about because the Big Ten knows they are, and they don't fight it. They just live with it. But it's time that we got to stop doing it. That narrative that ESPN, again, that chokehold that they have, it's no longer a chokehold. It's not even a sleeper hold. Now they may have they're grabbing people at this point, and people are starting to push them off. And that's a scary feeling. I get it. When you've had a chokehold on something for so long, and now people are starting to push you away, that can be scary. But you know what? It shouldn't be, Fitz. And I'll end it with this. If you're that good, just go win. It's all you got to do. Nothing. You can't take away anybody or anybody can't say anything, and you can shut up everybody if you win. And I don't mean, well, Georgia won, so they're the best. That means the SEC is the best. No. I'm talking about the conference as a whole. Go win the games.
Yep.
Don't lose to teams that you're superior to. Don't lose those football games. There's nothing that says, well, we played Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, and then the next week we played Mississippi State. So we went through a ringer, so we lost to Mississippi State. No, there's no guidelines that tell you that you get to lose a football game. I'm sorry. That's not what it means. Go win the football games, period. And that's the end of the story. I don't want to hear anything else. You do that, you shut everybody up. When you don't have the legs, Fitz, to claim superiority.
Exactly.
Period. End of story.
I want to point this out that we had 4 blowouts in the first round. Just because it rains 4 days in a row doesn't mean it rains every day.
Correct.
We don't know what's going to happen in this first round again next year.
Nope.
I would tend to believe most of the home teams will win. And that gets back to my argument that I do believe the top 4 seeds should get the buys. I do believe that. But that means the conference champions that don't get a bye should be guaranteed a home game. And that's their advantage, not the bye. Playing a home game is an advantage because it's huge for the program. What we're missing here isn't that there were 4 blowouts. We had 4 college football games that we've never had before. I haven't seen the ratings yet, but I imagine they're massive despite the blowouts.
Right.
I watched games to the end, even though they were blowouts. It was like a Christmas gift that I've never gotten before. So I don't think the argument here is we should just go to 8. Stop. I think the argument is let's go to 16 and not have buys. Let's play 8 games. We get 4 more games, and then everything beyond that is the same as what we're going to have. I'm all in, man. I'm all in on this thing because we've already seen how it's damaging the accepted narratives. Why? Because they can't stuff the ballot box.
Correct.
They didn't get 6 SEC teams in. That's why they wanted it. If we have 6 in, we're going to win a lot of games and we can say we're the best. Well, if we're going to do 12, let's cap it at 3 per conference and really get some variety. I much rather, and I'm going to say this emphatically, I much rather have an Indiana team that beat everyone it should beat than an Alabama team who could not do the same. Period. I agree. Maybe they didn't belong, but the answer isn't, well, Indiana didn't belong. We should put in another SEC team. No, we're done with that narrative. We're done. We don't accept it. And most of us are pushing back, including your friends supposedly in the Big Ten. They're done with it too, even though Indiana kind of proved the point here. But they, as you've mentioned, Big B, have enough self-awareness to understand what their conference is really about.
Absolutely. Well said, my man. Thank everybody for tuning in today. We appreciate it. There's going to be a fun couple of games that come up. I'm looking forward to the next round of this. Arizona State gets started I think Arizona State can win this football game. As we get closer to it, we'll break it down even more. So, again, I appreciate everybody. Remember to like, follow, subscribe, continue to hit those comment sections, and definitely hit the notification bell so you know when all Big 12 Insiders content comes out. We appreciate you guys. We will talk to you soon. Have a good one.
Thank you for watching the Big 12 Insiders, your Big 12 sports show. This has been a Spirit Street production.